Cordero. I am going to be reading 2 short stories for you this evening. And before I get started with that, earlier this year I wrote this song to go along with one of my poems. And we will love and love and love. We will love and love and love. About 2 weeks later, I wrote this one. Vengeful bitch is God. Vengeful bitch is true. Vengeful bitch is good to you if you are good to them. Yeah, I felt that one in my soul, or what's left of it. So today we're going to hang with my vengeful bitch side, and I hope you're down to ride with some revengeful stories. I don't know anybody that doesn't like one. But I hope you're down for it. This first one is going to be an older piece, and then the second one's going to be newer. This first one is Grandchild. I am Grandchild. Grandmother was known as Sonora. Grandfather was Inocencio. They were both Davilas, but I am only Grandchild. I lived with grandmother and grandfather during the great snowfall, while the world went cold and bitter. We survived within our alpine cabin while cities were swallowed up, oceans froze over, and all but the tallest mountains disappeared. The snow was corrosive despite its pure white, biting but gleamingly beautiful, suffused with the poison humans had burned down into the land and up into the heavens. Grandmother and grandfather blamed the snow for making me what I am. Their daughter, heavy with pregnancy after a night with a drifting man, was caught outside when the blizzard began. They told me she weathered 2 days and nights of the snowfall before staggering onto their front steps. She fainted from fright when I was born. She did not wake for days. Then she left while my grandparents slept, went out into the snow to die. Her name was Esperanza. I do not know if grandmother and grandfather wanted to throw me out into the snow too. I only know they did not. Grandmother wove me a coat, hat, and gloves. Grandfather carved me a mask. I wore these things every day so that they did not need to know my face or my body. But I grew quickly, and they could not keep pace. My feet peeked from beneath woven hems. My broad back undid stitched seams. Grandfather had to carve 3 larger masks because I kept making the wood crack. Yet, despite their attempts to hide me, my grandparents and I shared many things. We cooked, read, and played together. We wrote, sang, and dreamt. We watched the snow fall together, tallied the days together, huddled around a static-filled radio and waited for clear skies together. And when the snowfall lessened, 4 weeks after its inception, I was ready for when we wanted to navigate the new world together. But grandmother and grandfather discovered they could not wander beyond the cabin door. Their heavy bodies sank into snowdrifts, and their brown skins blistered into scratches and sores. Illness went undeterred by outerwear and balm, poultice or compress. And despite how resourceful grandmother and grandfather were, they soon learned the world was no longer theirs. I am the only one who could leave the cabin floors. My body is light, it does not sink. My skin is hard, it does not welt. I remember how my grandparents' wrinkles creased deeper, creating crannies and shadows in which they tried to hide their fear. But I could still read it. They were afraid of themselves, of how trapped they were, of how every plan and preparation had failed. They tried for months, clung desperately to hope, but every venture into the snow wounded them. They could not live, they could not thrive. They were only grave wounds. Grandmother died first. The toxic snow made her body spasm and thrash until her heart stopped. Then grandfather changed. The light within him went out, and nothing I did renewed his flame. Grandchild, he said, I will teach you how to let grandmother's soul pass on. Grandfather led me down into the cellar. He pulled a key from his pocket. Past the bountiful food stores and supplies lay a large carved trunk that had always been locked. On this day, grandfather opened it, and from its bowels he hefted yards of aromatic linens, oils, candles, and incense, boughs of cedar and juniper. I helped grandfather carry these into the light. We burned incense and candles together, perfumed grandmother's body together. We wrapped her tightly over and around each leg, covering each arm, finger, and toe. She became swathed in light, just like the earth, just like the future. After grandfather braided grandmother's hair, he kissed her lips, and I knew when he covered her face that I had lost both of them forever. Lay these down upon the ground, grandfather told me, as he opened the cabin door. He pulled a sack of porous stones from the closet, rested the cedar and juniper boughs upon my back. I followed his directions, packing snow with my legs. I took the light rocks from his fingers, one by one, arranging them into an altar. Then I laid down the boughs, nesting them carefully so that grandmother could rest. Then grandfather brought her out. He stumbled. His arms were bare as he carried her, and I heard snow sizzle upon his skin. When he lay grandmother down, he sank to his knees beside her, and with the matches he held, he lit the dry boughs and linen. Grandmother burned. Grandfather watched. It was nightfall when he and I returned to the cabin. Grandmother was ash, and grandfather's skin was rash, broken and bleeding. Grandfather did not leave grandmother until her last flames blew out, and now he stood winded and pained at the countertops, preparing medicine he said was for us both. I feared grandfather's trembling fingers, his ragged breath, the grief riding his back, and the tears he wept into pots. The foul-smelling mash he cooked was different than any other, and when he held it to my mouth, I did not want to eat. I am not sick, I told grandfather. I have never been sick. This is not medicine for illness. It is medicine for grief. Let us both have peace. I quivered. Tengo miedo, abuelo. Lo sé, but look. Grandfather took off one of my gloves. He pressed in close. I felt his heart pounding, his chest heaving. I am afraid too. There were only... And then my breath caught. My eyes watered. This was the first and last time grandfather touched me. And as my own breath trembled, grandfather pushed back my masks and smiled into my face. He held the spoon to my mouth, a silver tear falling from his eye. Here, bebe, grandfather said. Te amo. I could not reject his wishes. He fed me half the bowl, then ate the rest. The poison was quick, burning as it sank into my abdomen, but as I fell over, I held onto grandfather, and grandfather held on to me. His hand still clutched me when I awoke. His skin was gray, his eyes clouded white, and grandfather's body smelled strangely sweet as I roused from blackout sleep. My grandparents had not wanted to leave me alone, but still they were gone. And although I wanted to help grandfather's soul pass on, I could not bring myself to oil and perfume him. I could not wrap him up or place him upon an altar, because if I did, there would be no body beside me. I removed my coat, gloves, and mask, and sat naked in mourning. I wept for many moons, yet on a day when the sun shone brightly, two men burst through my door. They were dressed in white, as sparkling as the snow, limbs hissing with each move they made. The men sounded of wind and machine, of whistles, gears, and wheezing. They were graceless, clattering about my home, looting what they chose. Did they not see me? They did not hear me. And then they laid their hands on Grandfather. I fought back. I chirped my wings. I stamped my feet. When the men looked around in confusion, I realized my naked skin had changed to hide me. I flew and trampled them. My hard skin absorbed the men's blows, and I threw them against the walls. I felt them bleed onto my body, heard them scream, shout, and cry. I thrust forth my thorax, and when I whipped round one final kick, the men crumbled under my anger. I threw them out into the snow, and they sank out of sight. I, Grandchild, then packed a bundle of supplies and tied it across my chest. I lit incense and candles, spoiled oil upon Grandfather and the floors. I went outside and lined the cabin with the porous stones. I laid down cedar and juniper boughs. I wrapped the walls, windows, and roof. The linen swathed everything in white, just like the earth, just like the past. And I stood beside it as it burned until everything was rendered ash. The corrosive snow still falls today, though slowly and not so heavily. It drifts through gray skies, settling upon whatever I let it smother. This world belongs to me and it, both of us bleak and stark white. But as I fly, the seas thaw, the sun shines brighter, and a copse of trees grows from nothing. I, Grandchild, survive. She, Earth, does too. And we, together, embrace the new. I'm glad it didn't suck. Y'all down for one more?
Woo!
Okay, this one is called Roots. Her teeth flashed in the taillights of the muddied silver pickup. Sharp curses and growled protests mixed into the sweltering night air, her brown, bleeding limbs flailing against his men as they dragged her from the compound she'd erected to guard the last trees in Magueyes. We will take it back! Her body slapped against the metal flatbed when they threw her in. Her voice swung low, hands circling her two children as they pressed in. Our hands will drag you into the ground. Two of his men jumped into the cabin. Another clambered into the bed, rifle lowered between her eyes. She trained her gaze on Rivera, unwavering as mud and rock spun into the wheel wells, unflinching as breaking waves of a sludge-filled sea swallowed the engines revving. Her glare rode his shoulders after she disappeared, Rivera feeling it while standing between the thick rails of the gate he'd broken, his pale fingers squeezing her brass key until his skin burned the edges of its teeth. Beyond the withered remains of El Bosque Seco, tucked into the crags of stripped mountains, Yuisa, keeper of the trees, had built a quiet stronghold of reinforced concrete. There she hid the last of the palms, calabashes, mamey, flamboyanes, tabonuco, palo colorado, and ceiba. Less than 4 acres, but worth so much money Rivera couldn't make sense of the zeros. He thought he'd quickly overwhelm her firepower, but as he pushed strewn sandy blonde locks from his sweaty face, he followed the blood slicking his boots back to the downed bodies. Over 3/4 of his troops carpeted the muddy, makeshift road leading to the compound, his mangled dead amongst hers. He and those left would have to push them into the sea before the too close sun ripped its way into the sky. But first, Rivera needed to see it. He stared into Yuisa's compound, shaken by the fact that he almost destroyed what he came for. He and his men had only stopped firing when her voice came over loudspeakers, Yuisa pleading her surrender after they broke past the second ring of reinforced concrete walls. With their rifles and machine guns pointed at her third barrier, she had to sacrifice herself to stop them from piercing the wide, high, and deep walls that enclosed the grove. Now Rivera stood in front of the closed stone doors and pressed. Humidity. He didn't think he'd miss it. After growing up in Magueyes, where atmosphere stuck like spit. But when the trees disappeared, air became tight and fine like a knife's edge. Goose flesh rippled across his body as Rivera stood between maturing trunks and rustling leaves. He closed his eyes and thanked his God, spreading arms wide to welcome humidity's softening blanket. She was propagating, Rivera's arborist, Garcia, explained while underlining Yuisa's research. He and Rivera stood within the caretaker's quarters, a 2-bedroom concrete square in the middle of the grove. It had a small living room, kitchenette, bathroom, and windows in every wall. Felt like the trees were looking in, crowded. Planted on staggered platforms that descended toward the apartment, the trees were arranged by maturity. The eldest on the lowest level, saplings at the top, a few hundred slits in the concrete roof let orange dawn filter through thickly paned glass. Fluorescent grow lights running on generators would burn at night to provide most of what the dangerous sun could not. Humidifiers flickered on and off. Rivera and Garcia pored over Yuisa's documents. She'd started her work before everyone took the heat age seriously. She rescued specimens, planted them here under her protection. Rivera stared at the ceiba she somehow transplanted from Vieques. Gnarled trunk wider than 3 men, roots so grand they looked like rivers sloping into the ground. Standing beside the caretaker's quarters, it had 2 ceibas on either side, the smaller trees young enough to retain thorns. He remembered his grandmother calling those thorns spirit ladders, running as they did from the ground to the towering almond-shaped leaves. Whooping, hollering, and snide laughter filled the grove, Rivera's attention drawn to a commotion at the doors. He walked up the stairs between the platforms, realizing his people were celebrating the arrival of the 3 men who disposed of Yuisa and her children. One of them waved something that caught the dim light. "Tenga jefe!" Beto chucked it into Rivera's palm with a wide, flashing grin. "Too fancy for that dead woman." A silver heart-shaped locket, filigree front and back, thin chain. It popped open with a tiny click. Pictures of a girl and boy neither older than 10. Rivera grimaced and shoved it back into the man's chest. "I don't do trophies." Beto tossed his head back and laughed. "This whole place is a trophy." Rivera clicked his tongue, crossed his arms. "It's a trophy even if you sell it piecemeal." He ground his teeth, bit back criticisms, fearing the other men would align themselves with Beto. "You sure they're dead? I don't want her and those kids showing up here and making good on her threats." Beto blinked. What threats? Taking us back, dragging us into the ground. People shifted, their faces darkened. What? Beto rubbed the back of his head. We didn't know you spoke Yuisa's language. What are you talking about? She wasn't speaking English or Spanish. None of us understood what she was yelling. Beto looked him over. You don't look Indio. Because I'm not, cabron. Then how do you know what she was saying? He waved Beto off. We don't have time to argue. There's plenty of work for us tonight, and we need some sleep. Pero Rivera, you just didn't hear her, okay? He leaned into Beto, teeth bared. Understand. He walked down the stairs, and while Beto didn't retaliate, whispering continued well after the men tucked themselves into sleeping bags along the platforms. They were here to scavenge, to earn enough money to buy tickets for the next rockets, but even vultures want to sleep amongst trees. Rivera stirred in the apartment bedroom, linen sheet and cotton pillow sliding off straw mattress. We will take it back. His eyelids peeled open. He sat up, thinking someone was calling, but the caretaker's quarters were quiet. His knees cracked as he stood, Rivera scratching his sore back while rounding the threshold and peering into the living room. Hazy, orange light silhouetted tree branches as they swayed. He blinked. The stone doors were closed. There were no windows in the grove walls. He looked at the ceiling. None of the slits were broken. A branch tapped against one of the living room windows. Hair on his body rose. He swiveled in place and hurried to the bedroom Garcia was using. It was pitch black, darker than it should have been. He flicked on the light. The bed was empty. He found newly painted branches on the walls, live branches outside the window crowding out the light that should have come through. Long, almond-shaped leaves covered the floor. Shuffling some with his foot, he found claw marks and bled. He pulled a handgun from the small of his back, followed the claw marks into the hall, through the living room. They stopped at the door. Garcia, Rivera called in a hushed voice, reaching for the handle. Garcia. He pulled the door open, found claw marks carved into the front of it. Banging on concrete walls made Rivera jump. Two faces were in the living room windows. Yuisa had walked toward him with those kids by her side. Small hands raised, mouths closed. She hadn't tried to hide them. Maybe they didn't let her. That boy and girl walked into the truck bed and waited, watched silently when Yuisa drew a blade and killed more of his men before being subdued. The two faces fell from the window. A wind whipped through the grove. Branches shuddered, lowered, snapped. Rivera's men screamed. They're in the trees! They're in the trees! They're in the trees! Running, slipping down wet stairs, rifles barking. That muzzle fire in the dark grove threatened everything Rivera had fought for. He threw himself onto controls on a desk in the living room, gripped the microphone and demanded his men stop shooting. Someone skidded into the apartment. Turn on the lights! Beto stood in the doorway. The wrong lights! Rivera fumbled. Garcia was supposed to oversee the grove, but eventually Rivera's hand fell over the dimmer switch. As white fluorescence brightened, torn, and empty sleeping bags dropped from the trees. Bodies strewn over roots, saplings wrapped around ankles and flung men into branches that ripped open chests. The eldest ceiba on the central platform grew, branches widening, roots thickening. It was close enough to the caretaker's quarters that Rivera saw its trunk rise and fall. Its leaves shuddered and splayed, gnarled branches stretching like it was rousing from sleep. They're in the trees! They're in the trees, Rivera cried. Ceiba branches tore through the apartment window and wrapped themselves around Beto's neck, green oval fruits swallowing his hands and gun. Leaves vined under Beto's shirt collar, snapping the chain of a heart-shaped locket and ferrying it back to the Ceiba's core. Rivera fired until he ran out of rounds, his mouth wide, lips trembling, feet bungling into the back bedroom. He barricaded the door with the lone desk, threw the mattress on top of it, and pulled the desk chair in front of him like a shield. He heard creaking, Rivera backing himself into a corner when shadows crept across the walls and floors. Fluid, like ink, they drew closer and closer, painting the entire room. He couldn't breathe. His whole body shook so hard his vision rattled. The shadows stopped swimming. They took on texture, like brushstrokes building. The shadows thickened, growing rougher, scalier until they rose from the concrete, shadows becoming branches and roots that creaked and moaned. They sprung into the air, surged towards Rivera, and wrenched the chair from his hands, flung the desk and mattress back. A wall of leaves swung the door wide. Branches and vines wrapped him tight and dragged him from the room. Blood ran down his palms, nails shredded by the concrete floor. Before being yanked through the apartment's front door, he saw Beto's body in the living room, overtaken by pink and yellow flowers blooming under lights. He crashed before the eldest Ceiba. Its leaves held his eyelids open, his mouth closed. The two younger Ceibas bent down, thorns along their trunks driving into Rivera's legs and arms. The elder Ceiba's roots swam into the air and cascaded like rivers, burying all but Rivera's head. The Ceiba craned forward. Laughter, a boy's and a girl's, swam from the tree hollow that met Rivera's face. Then Huisa's voice called, "Welcome to the ground, used to bury us."